To come up with good ideas and innovation, we need good debates. Not the shouting matches of pundits, but a direct exchange of ideas.
The duty of human beings in protecting human rights.
I don't see this. How you want to convince the Westerners? We are talking about human lives.
We are becoming much more polarized.
And I can
Time
speak for my
is
country.
up.
We're never gonna
Time
move
is
away from
up.
protecting
Time's
the
up.
individual
Time
rights.
is
Time's
up.
up.
Who's the winner? What can we learn from the crossfire? Tune in to Global Arena with me, Tian Wei, only on CGTN. Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and this is Global Arena, a special production of World Insight on CGTN. Masks wearing, quarantine, travel restrictions, lockdowns, and vaccinations. All these measures are implemented to prevent the coronavirus from further spreading. However, they have created debates from day one. Amid the pandemic, it's pretty much a big bone of contention. Quarantine versus individual liberty. Wearing a mask versus no mask. Meanwhile, privacy concerns at a time when you have so many different kinds of mobile apps. How much individual health data are we disclosing? Are we always being watched? The topic for debate today. There is more consensus on human rights amid the pandemic? Yes or no? Team A, they are for the motion. Yes, there is more consensus on human rights amid the pandemic. Team B, they're against the motion. There isn't more consensus on human rights amid the pandemic. My real honor to introduce the debaters. Team A, Professor Zhang Wei from China University of Political Science and Law, who's been doing research about human rights for decades. Welcome, Professor. Minister Alessandro Teixeira, who is a former Brazilian Minister of Development Industry and Foreign Trade, who has also organized the 2 presidential debates when he was serving the administrations. Welcome. Team B, Professor Xie Tao from Beijing Foreign Studies University, the expert in China on American political culture. Welcome. Last but not least, Team B, Frank Siren, best-selling author, documentary filmmaker, who has been a bridge building the links between Chinese and the Western press over the decade. Thank you. Meanwhile, we also have a special arrangement of a panel of observers and commentators. They're joining us now, virtually. Professor Kishore Mahbubani from National University of Singapore, former president of the UN Security Council. Professor Denise Conan from University of Hawaii, who has traveled to China in the 1980s and has been keen bridge builder for China and the United States. Last but not least, Robert Daly, director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the US from the Wilson Center based in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the panel of observers. Thank you. Last but certainly not least, we have a wonderful audience sitting with us here today. My sincere appreciation on behalf of the team for your presence here today. Thank you.
Debate rules. There'll be 3 rounds. First, opening argument. Every debater has 1.5 minutes to establish their argument. Second, free debate. Teams will be allowed to directly challenge each other and pose questions to their opponents. Each team has 8 minutes altogether. Then, final remarks. Each speaker will briefly sum up arguments and make a closing point. And finally, there will be a winning team. 31 audience members will have 1 vote each. 3 observers will have 5 votes each. When added together, there will be the final results.
So now, let's go to the very first round. The opening statement for Team A and Team B, everyone has 1.5 minutes. The countdown clock will be on the big screen for the last 10 seconds. Let's start with Team A, our first speaker, Professor Zhang Wei, 1.5 minutes.
It's a great pleasure to be here to share with you my understanding of the human rights developments during the COVID-19. I have 3 keywords to describe what I feel. The first word is the right to life. During the COVID-19 process, we realized that the right to life has been upheld as the most important factors to fight against the pandemic. What was experienced in China, we see how important it is to save us from this disaster. My second keyword is the poverty alleviation. As we understand, Chinese government has been making a great pledge to fight against poverty. And the Chinese government was one of the very few governments to be able to fulfill the minimum goals. And also now we are up to the sustainable development age. We are able to fulfill this goal in advance, before 2030. The third keyword is non-discrimination equality. As we are fighting the COVID-19, what has been experienced in US is a very important show to us.
All right, time is up. I'm so sorry you're running out of time.
Sorry?
This could also be a good reminder for our other panelists that this is going to be a very limited time. You talk about life, right to life, poverty alleviation, and some of the other points, whether they are up to debate. Let's go to Team B, first speaker, Professor Xie Tao. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Tian Wei. Very honored to be here today. I just want to make the argument that there is no consensus about human rights. We do have a universal declaration of human rights, but there is no universal consensus on the priority of different aspects of human rights. Take the United States as an example. During the COVID-19 crisis, many Americans protested against the social distancing, mandatory face covering, etc., in the name of their political rights. And so they say the government has no right to limit my travel around. I have the right to work. And so they are exercising their political rights to fight for economic rights, right? And so you can see, because of this, Americans are sacrificing about 600,000 lives on the altar of political rights. And then you look at the other opposite, take the case of China. In China, people have different attitudes about human rights. The Chinese government does prioritize the right to life. And so the government mandates this quarantine, mandate face covering, and there's a lot of electronic monitoring of people's movement. And yes, for many Westerners, this sounds like a violation of their political rights. But look at the result. The Chinese government has been most successful, I would say, stunningly successful in keeping the pandemic under control. And so you can see the contrast. There is no agreement. There is just a disagreement. Okay.
Time is up. Thank you very much, Professor Xie, for sticking with the time. You argue about priorities and differences. Now let's go to the 4-motion team, Team A, number 2 speaker, Minister Teixeira.
First, thank you very much for the CGTN, Team Wen, for the invitation, my colleagues here. We live in a complex world, and we have 2 poles today. One pole is called individualism, and another is called collectivism. And this pandemic has shown the 2 faces. And I'm sure when we come out of this pandemic, we're going to see that society needs to arrive in a more consensus way about human rights, meaning your individual rights cannot overrule the collective rights. Countries that we see that kept the individual rights over the collective rights, as Professor just mentioned, are countries like Brazil, United States, and India. They respond for more than 50% of the total deaths in the pandemic. So I'm sure after this terrible moment for our society, we're going to realize and see the numbers that collectivism is the most important element. We need to strike a balance between individualism and collectivism if we want to keep our society prosperous. Thank you very much.
Thank you. As we know, Team A is for the motion. There is more consensus on human rights amid the pandemic. Last speaker, opening arguments from Team B. You're against that motion.
I'm against that motion. Thanks for having me. And I would like to say that COVID is a historical event because it was never clear, more clear than now, that there are different balances in Asia, and we can say not only China, but also Asia and in the West. The Western people, they balance more into the direction of individual rights. The people in Asia, they balance more into the needs of society. And this was actually no conclusion, this big event, this pandemic, but these two ways of dealing with problems of societies, they are more separate than ever. And it's more clear than the Western people don't want to be treated like the Chinese people were treated in China. And on the other side, the Chinese people are saying, no, we don't want to be treated as individual. We want the society, we want the government to solve the problem. And now there's a discussion needed how we can get together. But we have to see that we are more separated than ever before because of this pandemic.
Time is up. Thank you so much for sticking to the time once again. So we have arguments about individual rights vis-a-vis collective rights, about case studies, China, US, Brazil, India, and some of the other countries. We also have a different opinion about whether there is consensus within societies themselves or not. For now, I want to test the temperature of our audience today. We're going to have a preliminary round of voting. Every one of you have one plate in your hand, right? Our little device. So you got the two colors. One color is orange for Team A for the motion. The other is blue for Team B against the motion. By the way, it's not about which side of the argument you agree, but rather which team is more convincing today. Okay, so let's have a preliminary vote. 3, 2, 1, let's go. Okay, I got the number. Thank you so much. You can put down. Thank you. So the number is, the preliminary round of voting from our audience, 7 for Team A, or for the motion. 24 for Team B, or against the motion. Once again, I want to emphasize the number is not the result. But later, after all the debate, there will be a real voting. Let's go to our next round, free debate. Every one of the team will have a collective time of about 8 minutes. Altogether, 16 minutes or so. You need to make the best use of the 8 minutes that you have collectively. Same here. Let's start from Team A.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I want to go back to the motion concept, okay? Especially for our public that is watching us. The motion talks about if the pandemic will lead to a more consensus of human rights. It's not if it's leading right now, but if it will lead. And we will lead. Because after we come out of the pandemic, people are going to look at the numbers. The numbers are already there. It's showing that the countries that try to observe and respect only the individual rights, again, Brazil, China, India are the countries that are suffering more. It's not the question if I like more or don't like more. It's the question where is most efficient in a time of disorientation. If you don't respect social distance, and if you believe that you can do whatever you want, independently of your loved ones, of your society, you're gonna pay a price, and these numbers are clear. It's a clear orientation on that. So our point, our motion, yes, pandemic will lead to more consensus of our society because we will understand that individual rights can never overrule the social rights. And that's very, very important.
Okay.
Mr. Ignacio, yeah, I agree with you that, we should learn lessons from the past. For example, what happened during the First World War, what happened during the Second World War. So we human beings should learn from the past to avoid the same thing to repeat, right? So you mentioned about, yes, we should learn about these rules, how to best control the pandemic. But unfortunately, like I said, countries are different in terms of political institutions and values. Countries do learn, but they learn very slowly. And so they have a pretty long learning curve. So I would imagine that maybe 10 years from now, we would be better appreciate, what should be done if we have a similar crisis. But right at the moment, look at the US media coverage of Chinese government's responses to COVID-19. And so you can see there's clearly no learning the lesson. Instead, they are saying the Chinese government is trampling human rights, etc. Again, like I said, different governments prioritize different aspects of human rights. In many parts of the world, they prioritize individual political rights, like my colleague said. But in other parts of the world, governments and people value more about the right to life and the right to a secure job.
Professor, I disagree with you. The past is important to observe, but we live in a completely different world right now. We are not talking about World War I, World War II. We are talking about today. Yeah. And today, although you have different perception, different values in the countries, we are talking about human lives. Okay? And this cannot have different perception. This you cannot have different values. You need to have the same values and the same perception. A life is the same value in Brazil, in Africa, in China, is a human life, and that's what we need to be convinced of.
But you have to see the reality. It's all about what you think should be. The reality is that the Western people say, we want to keep our individual rights. We don't want the solution China is proposing. And the Chinese are saying, more than ever, we don't want to have the way the Western countries handle this crisis, handle this pandemic. So they are far away. They're moving even more far away. You have to accept it. You don't really accept the reality. And if you don't accept the reality that Western countries and Chinese have different perspectives of how to run a society.
But again, it's not a discussion between China and Western. That's not the discussion. The discussion is different. The discussion is the society, the world society will realize that you need to have a balance between individualism and collectivism.
Yes, but before we talk about a world society, first need to talk about the different perspectives and different historical experiences in different nations, in different countries, in different areas of the world. Because that was the problem in the past, that there was basically only one view of the world which was counting, and it was the Western view of the world. This is changing now. So we can take a view in the future, and we can talk about how we find a compromise between these different views. But the first step is we need to accept there are different views and different historical experiences.
I think we're getting more consensus on human rights now.
That sounds not very convincing, actually.
From the surface, you see we have divergent ideas about human rights. But in the essence, we're getting more and more concerns. For example, back to many years, we have a debate about universality of human rights. But now it's upheld by all the countries. I think the problem now we are facing is not about the consensus of human rights, it's about we forget in some parts of the world the duty of human beings. in protecting human rights. The second, it's also very important that we learn from history that the right to life is most important during this pandemic. It's the only way to save our human beings in this process.
But if it's like you were saying, it would be easy to convince the Westerners about the Chinese way of handling the pandemic. I don't see this. How you want to convince the Westerners? They don't want the Chinese solution.
Frank, but we have already results. When you look the way that President Donald Trump conducted the crisis in the United States, one of the reasons he could not be re-elected is because he paid attention too much for individual society. So now we have a new president in the United States, Joe Biden, that is saying we need to vaccinate the whole population. We need to limit the individuals.
Donald Trump started this already and Joe Biden fulfilled it. There's not a big difference between them.
Oh, there is.
The big difference is that the Americans want to decide themselves. They want to have their rights and they want to go to court if they don't accept what the government is doing. That's different.
Yeah, but...
Yeah. You know, Mr. Ginasio, remember during one of these protests against the social distancing in Michigan, you know, these were one of the more violent, and so people were holding these placards, give me liberty or give me COVID. Now that very clear message, of course, that does not represent the majority of Americans, but they do represent a very significant minority view in the United States. That is political rights.
I do agree completely. It's a minority.
But that's a very significant minority. Okay, very significant. That's why Donald Trump got 72 million votes.
It's all about minorities. Yeah. That the minorities have the same right than the majority.
Also, back to your point, I think I would agree with my colleague's characterization of your argument. That is, you are saying what the world ought to be. You are talking about a normative world. So every human being should respect the right to life. Yes, we all agree. But in some countries, they think the right to life comes less than the right to individual liberty. Okay, so I think we're talking about the reality, not about what the world ought to do.
We are talking about what the pandemic will conduct. And you're going to see in every single society, and I can bet here, that those countries that sustain individual rights overrule the collective right, they're going to have a problem. The numbers speak for themselves. Yeah, the numbers speak for themselves, you know.
So you're saying the realities are changing?
Yes, exactly.
But how do you want to convince the Chinese or the public here to go the Western way?
I don't need to convince anybody about this. I'm looking to reflection. We are human beings, so you can reflect. You look the numbers, you see countries that suppose and support individual rights are 50% of every death in the world.
So then you would say who's reflecting less? If you say there has to be one direction.
No, not what I say that there has to be a balance. So the question is, pandemic lead to more consensus? Is leading to more consensus? We cannot only balance by individual. Because if you only think about the individual, we're going to live in an anarchy. Anybody can do whatever they want. That's not human rights. Human right is to respect your loved ones, is to respect your neighbor. Maybe I have this view, Jack, because I come from a developing country, okay? Maybe that, but we know, my colleagues from Africa, from China understands that, okay? We are talking, and Professor talk about poverty, talk about hunger, okay? You need to have the right of living, and the right of living, you cannot overrule the other people, okay? Otherwise, we build a world that is unbalanced. That's the world right now, but that's not the world I fight for.
You cannot only look at the media, because media is controlled by the powerfuls. It does not represent the whole picture. And we can see that...
3 minutes left for Team Bay.
Yes, the right to life in this critical situation is more important.
Yeah, but I tell you, the normal people, they don't care about the media. They are on the streets in Germany protesting for their civil rights.
But they are not the majority. Yes. They are a minority, as you said, a significant minority, but they are minority.
Okay.
It's important that a minority can protest and can say, we want to have our individual rights. That's a very important thing in Western society. So you can't say it's just the minority, we don't care.
No, it's not what I said. It's not what we are saying.
So what did you say?
I said that a minority has the right to protest, but has not the right to kill other people because they are contaminated. We are not talking about protesting, about defending your ideas. We are talking about human lives. If you get infected and you think I have my individual right to go around, and you go to a restaurant, you go to a public place, you can kill another. That's genocide. That has a name in history.
But if it would, though, the people in Western countries would immediately be convinced by your arguments.
But they are. They are looking the numbers. They are. They are. They are.
They're complaining all the time that they have to stay at home, that they can't go shopping, that they can't go out. That's a big movement in all the Western countries. So don't tell me it's not.
No, they complain, but they stay at home. I'm saying, and I'm gonna complete for Professor John to speak. But the point is that you need to respect the first and the most important amendment of United Nations is the right of life. And the right of life is not just control disease, is the right to eat, right to live, has to be a citizen. And you cannot do that if you have individual rights that overrule collectivism.
But people want to know what's happening with their data which are collected. They don't feel comfortable in the West that the government's collecting all this data. That's completely different than in China.
Less than 2 minutes for Team B.
Look around the United States. In the United States, there's a very strong, widespread consensus. This is wired in the gene of Americans, that is anti-government. They want individual liberty. So whenever the government says you have to stay at home, social distancing, you have to put on a mask, Americans don't like this. So I can say that partly Donald Trump did not act very decisively at the very beginning is because of this inherent American political culture against a big, intrusive government. And I think Americans are learning the lesson. But I don't think they probably will learn the lesson very well. Whereas look at it in China, Chinese people here, well, obviously these measures caused some inconveniences for many of us. You cannot travel around, there are many restrictions, but most Chinese accept these measures readily. They understand that the government is doing this for the welfare of the people.
So what are you arguing for? What are you arguing for?
The political rights can be important, but here the right to life, the government's responsibility to protect its own citizens is more important.
You only have 1 minute left. Yes. Professor
Thank
Zhang,
you.
Professor Zhang and Minister.
You agree with us, apparently.
Yes.
No, you didn't listen.
I'm saying
the U.S. does not represent the rest of the world.
No, it does not. No, it does not.
But let's talk about Germany, France, all over the same.
Yeah. But what I learned from different people, my friends, they all observe the rule. They stay at home and try to keep safe. My friends in America, in Europe, they do the same thing as we do here. So I'm not sure that how do you define that?
Less than 1 minute left for Team A.
And I do agree with Professor Xie that China is doing exactly this, is putting collectivism on the top of individualism. But the other societies that started the pandemic to put individualism on the top are changing. So that's my point. That's why my motion is that in the future, we do want to have more consensus. I'm not saying consensus. I'm saying more consensus about the importance of human rights.
For the first time in history, people in Asia and in Africa and in other world regions, they can decide to do what they want. They can decide their way of life, and they're going to do it. And for the first time, for many centuries, the Westerners have to see that their way of life is not unique anymore. And this leads to a separation, probably in the future, but the future is far away. There will be a consensus, but first we have to accept that there are different ways of life.
20 seconds for Team B.
Okay, let me close this. We all agree there are universal human rights, but we are becoming much more polarized over which particular aspects of human rights should be prioritized. We are becoming more polarized. So let me stop here.
Okay, Team A, 20 seconds only.
We realize that we are getting more and more consensus in the UN. And this is a very clear trend that all the governments are observing human rights in their whole operation.
I agree completely with, so our position is clear. We will have more consensus in the future, and pandemic would help that.
Do not agree at all.
Team A,
like
you
I
have
said,
5 seconds.
we are becoming increasingly more polarized over human rights.
We don't believe this. We believe that after we're going to see more consensus because you're going to see that the right of life is the most important element.
Your time is up. 10 seconds left.
I agree that we all agree that the right to life is sacred. But we disagree. I mean, you look around the world, people disagree about how do you go about protecting the right to life.
And I can
Time
speak for my
is
country.
up.
We're never gonna
Time
move
is
away from protecting
Time's up,
the
time's
individual
up,
rights.
time's up.
Never ever.
I applaud to all of you. Once again, they do not necessarily represent personally the opinions they are supporting today, but you have presented your reasons, your numbers, and your logic. I want to thank you for that. It's been a long time we haven't heard about civilized debates, right? For quite some time. Thank you.
You're watching breaking news on CGTN.
CGTN with the latest market-moving headlines around the world. Welcome to the world today on CGTN.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines. To come up with good ideas and innovation, we need good debates. Not the shouting matches of pundits, but a direct exchange of ideas.
The duty of human beings in protecting human rights.
I don't see this. How you want to convince the Westerners? We are talking about human lives.
We are becoming much more polarized right to life.
And I can speak
Time
for my
is
country.
up.
We're never gonna
Time
move
is
away from
up.
protecting
Time's up,
the
time's
individual
up,
Time is
time's
up.
up.
Who's the winner? What can we learn from the crossfire? Tune in to Global Arena with me, Tian Wei, only on CGTN.
We are joined virtually by 3 commentators, observers from different parts of the world. I'm so honored to see all of them. Professor Kishore Mahbubani from National University of Singapore, former president of United Nations Security Council. Good to see you, Professor. Professor Denise Conan from the University of Hawaii. She traveled to China in the 1980s. She has been this bridge builder between China and the United States ever since, particularly from the state of Hawaii. Welcome, Professor. Robert Daly, Director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the US from the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Mr. Daly, what a pleasure to see you once again. Now, you all have heard earlier debate among the wonderful debaters coming from different parts of the world on the issue. There is more consensus on human rights amid pandemic or not. Now, we would love to give you, every one of you, 1 to 2 minutes to state your opinions and reactions to this debate. Professor Conan, you want to go first?
So I'm coming from the University of Hawaii, and we're in a unique position here because in Hawaii, we have a fusion of the Eastern and Western thinking. We have a strong heritage with Asia background. So I think that is part of the reason that we are very successful in the combat against COVID-19. We have the advantage of individualism and innovation, and also the recognition of the importance of communities. It is the coming together that I think Team A was trying to talk about, this opportunity to bring the best of both worlds together for this battle. But I have to say, we are also, as a country, the US, facing many divisions that Team B talked about when it comes to the balancing of the concept we have of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How do we bring these in balance? And there's differing opinions for sure.
Thank you, Professor. We're going to come back to you for specific questions you have for Team A and Team B. For now, let me go to Mr. Daly, your take about the earlier debate.
Two thoughts. First, I think that this business of reducing the question to collective rights and individual rights is a little bit of a false binary. It's overstated, absolute, and tends to be reductive. So I would caution people against that. It is not the case that the Americans who are out there, in my view, foolishly not wearing masks and social distancing, were claiming that their individual rights trumped the right to life of others. They were mostly concerned about their freedoms of speech, freedoms of information, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. When Americans saw China's later response to COVID, when China went into lockdown, in general, there was a positive reporting about the discipline and the suffering of the Chinese people. Americans didn't think that was crazy. They were concerned about freedoms of the press, freedoms of speech. They were asking questions like, does social distancing and mask wearing mean that there shouldn't be any criticism? And then secondly, and lastly for this, I think that this argument needs to take us beyond COVID, the tyranny of the now, because what we make of human rights is going to be a long-term question. It's a cultural question, it's a moral question, it's a political question. Crises also pass and they can be forgotten remarkably quickly. Societies are also shaped by their sense of the everyday, the ordinary, the non-crisis times.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daly. For now, I want to go to Professor Mahbubani.
When I was ambassador to the UN in 1998, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And at that point in time, some Western statesmen, led by Helmut Schmidt, the former Chancellor of Germany, proposed that the world should adopt a Universal Declaration of Human Responsibilities to match a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What every citizen needs to understand is that while he or she has human rights, he or she also has human responsibilities to his or her fellow citizens.
Wonderful discussions already happening. So I want to have our debaters to respond to several of the points you raised. Let's start. Mr. Minister.
I want to raise one point with Mr. Daly when he talks about human rights. One point that is striking, and we need to absorb that our democracy, because he wants to talk more about a complex issue that I agree, is in danger, is sick. Okay, is he sick? Why? Because if you see the numbers of United States, not the United States, you can compare Brazil, you never had so many people with guns goes to schools and shoot children. Guys, we cannot accept this. It's a common sense that we will need to arrive in a consensus very soon, and the pandemic is helping that, because this is the explosion.
But as I observe the reality, and we need not to talk only about obligations, but also about reality, I only see that these, the Western countries are more reluctant if we talk about the responsibilities, and they're more relying on the rights system, whereas Asian countries are talking much more about responsibilities. And that's actually the reality. That will be the case in the future and in the next years. And it will be more difficult to find a consensus.
Is cultural difference a huge phenomenon in this regard? Mr. Daly.
I think that it is often overstated And I think that the rights and responsibilities approach that Professor Mahbubani has proposed is one way to ameliorate some of the gaps. I think that that's a very useful framework for this discussion. But human rights or human responsibilities, the premise here is that they are universal. There's a second question. If we can say they're universal, who decides? Who gets to say what the responsibilities are? Who gets to say what the rights are?
Thank you very much for those responses. I want to add one more very important dimension from one of the greatest American philosopher, of the 20th century was John Rawls, and he wrote a beautiful book called A Theory of Justice. And he said, at the end of the day, the most just society is the one that you want to join blind, not knowing whether you're in the top 10% or bottom 10%. And therefore, the most just society is the one that takes care of the bottom 10%. If you just focus on rights, what happens is that the top 10% benefits because they have all the freedoms, the capacity, the means, and all to enjoy the rights. But the bottom 10% are struggling day by day.
I like that. Not just theoretical debate, but rather a debate based on facts and look at the realities today.
I agree with Robert Daly. He just said he does not like this false binary of individual rights and collective rights. Right, look at the UN Convention. It's about civil and political rights vis-a-vis economic, social, and cultural rights, right? I think people around the world have different prioritizing system of different sets of values. And so in China, I just give you cite one very recent study by Nora Peoples, and his survey, and including World Value Survey, have repeatedly shown up again and again, surprisingly, that the Chinese people's support of the Chinese system is the highest among any country in the world. If the Chinese system, Chinese government's view of different aspects of human rights, is it appropriate? It's the Chinese people through these surveys, they have made their answers very clear.
Another point that we haven't touched on is the freedom of expression and the freedom of press. Mr. Daly earlier touched upon that. I don't think anybody has related yet to that. Let's go to Professor Mahbubani first.
When you look at it functionally, your voice can be cut off, not just by the state, as it happens in many countries. It can also be cut off if the media is dominated by a few rich people. And if when I watch Fox TV, I feel that I'm living on a different planet. I don't know what they are talking about. What reality are they dealing with? They paint a very harsh, dark view of the rest of the world. It has distorted so many minds in the United States who completely don't understand the real world at all. And that, I think, frankly, at some point becomes a crime. So at some point in time, if you really want to ensure that the people in a society get a fair and balanced perspective, you have to ensure that the channels of communication are neither dominated completely by the state, nor are they completely dominated by the private sector. And the hardest thing is this, to find the right balance between the two.
I'm eager to jump in because we've had many dialogues together, Tianwei, Sino-American dialogues, talking about these issues. Social media is really changing the landscape of how people receive news and get news. They're more likely to hear the kind of information that reinforces their views, and it is something that can be polarizing, bringing us apart.
Interesting. Access to resources in terms of how much your voice will be heard. That's an issue already seen as a result of social media and the division of opinions. Mr. Daly, I want to come back to you because you raised that point. It's only fair that we let you to respond to that and tell us how is it related to our topic today, which is there's more consensus or not in human rights during a pandemic.
Americans did not object to all of the sort of what seemed like rather severe social distancing, tracing, masks, the things that China did to beat COVID. They weren't criticizing that collective ethic. That was where they objected to Chinese treatment of COVID.
I think Bob's major point is about domestic politics, how people within a particular country, do they have the right to freedom of speech and freedom of movement, etc. These rights obviously are important. The Chinese government has issued a number of human rights white papers to enunciate Chinese government's position and also to document the Chinese government's progress towards these political rights. My whole point is that in this world, unfortunately, especially in the United States, I would say this, Western United States media has something like an inherent bias against the Chinese government's perspective.
We are saying that we are reaching more consensus does not mean that there are no differences. There are differences, of course.
That's the one thing I agree with you.
But it does not mean we are
Great,
reaching
thank
more
you.
consensus. Human rights are interrelated, interdependent to each other. And for example, you have to sometimes control the media because you cannot make false statements. So that's, for some people, they may be seen as a restriction, but it's a legal restriction. It does not mean that we are not reaching consensus. It's the consensus we have, actually.
Okay, our time is up for this round. So we might want to hear their final points after listening to the whole conversation.
Issues around human rights are including life, including liberty and freedom and the voice of the public. At the same time, there are so many disparities that I think are important to note, and I wish we would have more discussion.
Thank you, Professor Conan. Mr. Daly.
Just one quick observation about the motion for this debate. Consensus, this word has a very special status, especially in Chinese political rhetoric. And this is a particularly Chinese viewpoint. I understand it, but it's not something that Americans generally share. I think that if a lack of consensus makes China uncomfortable, China's going to be uncomfortable for a very long time.
Actually, consensus is also a political language being used in the UN system debate, as well as the congressional debate inside the United States. When I was a correspondent there, I did cover these stories, and I said that word every day when I report from Washington. Thank you, Mr. Daly. Now, Professor Mahbubani.
When you talk of freedom, if you're born in the bottom 10%, even in a wealthy country like the United States, and especially if you are Black, your chances of going to jail and spending decades in jail can be almost 50%. Now that's a real deprivation of freedom. If you want to understand what human rights really means, look at real data, real people, especially the very poor.
Thank you. I learned a lot through every one of your arguments and your questions. We do not necessarily have to agree on everything, but this debate itself is really worthwhile.
Human rights.
Human rights.
人权。
人权是啥？
I think human rights are basic rights that everyone should have access to, such as the right to have food, to not starve, to have shelter.
No matter what your skin color is, no matter what your nationality is, no matter what your gender is.
自由跟平等，人权就是能做自己想做的事儿呗。人得先有生命，才能有人权，就是得先活着，这是最基础的。然后就是中国的话，对比其他国家做的就是，我们现在都活着就挺好的了。对。
在国外是一个比较自由，但是自由导致说大家会太放任。
Wearing a mask is unhealthy.
They fake lying news to people.
完全的自由就是会侵犯到一些别人的利益。
At least 10 cities reported mass shootings.
It's our God-given right to protect ourselves, our family. It's America, right? We live free.
To come up with good ideas and innovation, we need good debates. Not the shouting matches of pundits, but a direct exchange of ideas.
The duty of human beings in protecting human rights.
I don't see this. How you want to convince the Westerners? We are talking about human lives.
We are becoming much more polarized.
And I can
Time
speak for my
is
country.
up.
We're never gonna
Time
move
is
away from
up.
protecting
Time's up.
the
Time's
individual
up.
rights.
Time's up.
Who's the winner? What can we learn from the crossfire? Tune in to Global Arena with me, Tian Wei, only on CGTN.
Now, we also have questions coming from our audience. The first line, okay, give that lady first. Yeah.
My name is Zheng Ying. My question is, what's the perception of human rights in China from the outside world? And are there some misunderstandings? What's your opinion? Thank
Professor
you.
Zhang, please.
Legally speaking, we have many consensus on international human rights treaties. That's why we have the treaty. But under the international human rights treaties, every state has its own, can choose its own path to fulfill all the human rights. That's also very clear. So at certain period of time, every state may taken different steps to achieve their human rights goals. For example, China is focusing very much on poverty alleviation in the past years and in the future.
Okay.
And that does not mean Chinese government does not pay attention to the rest of the human rights. They are interrelated to each other.
Okay, thank you. Final question, please. This gentleman.
Thank you very much. My name is Daniel Olo. I come from Kenya. Whenever we understand human rights, it's both ontologically and epistemologically, meaning that each country or each region deals with it individually. Now, basically my question is, what is the place of Africa in this kind of conversation? How do you think Africa can play in this kind of conversation? Thank you.
What do you think, since you're African yourself?
We are great, and we are doing a lot of good things there. For example, Kenya currently is also fighting issues to do with human rights. And here we are looking at issue of, do we restrict people from movement so that we contain the pandemic, or we leave them to move out so that the entire country goes to lockdown, or people die? So these are some of the difficult questions that we as Kenyans are also encountering. Thank you.
Totally understand. Now go to our debaters very briefly for your answer before we go to wrap up.
It's very simple at the end of the day. African countries will develop their own view on human rights and probably agree on some points, but on certain points they do not agree with other countries. And it will be even more complicated, but it will be also more diverse, and that's good.
Bringing more voices to the conversation, that's what they're suggesting.
Africa is a continent, so you have different perspectives on different countries. But the most important is there is a consensus between the African countries that human rights are important elements for the development of Africa. And what I mean by human rights is exactly what Professor Mabula said, is top, lower poverty, trying to get out of the trap that Africa and other developing countries are regarding poverty.
All right. Before we let all the panelists go, we want to have every one of you very briefly to make your final remarks, because only then they could give you the marks that you deserve. Let's go to Team B first, because Team A started. You Team B first.
Very simple. I'm a German living in China, and I don't want to limit freedom of speech because of a COVID pandemic. That's all. That shows the differences between the two parts of the world.
I think the word that we listen to here is common together, is unit as a strength, as a Chinese saying is. So without unit, without collectivism, we cannot get out of this pandemic. So that's our motion, is to support that there is more consensus on human rights in the future.
Thank you.
Well, the Chinese ancient wisdom says diversity in harmony. That's what the Chinese government has been trying to tell its counterparts around the world. But unfortunately, many Western governments cannot tolerant diversity, especially different perspectives on human rights. And so that's here why I'm saying that you can see a polarized world over human rights.
Okay, Professor.
We are seeing actually more consensus word about human rights. In this regard, we have African people as friends here. In China, there's a South-South human rights dialogue every 2 years. So we see this more and more dialogues between Chinese and international experts of human rights to discuss more and more. We are finding more and more common grounds in this field.
Now, it is the time to see who is more convincing today, Team A or Team B. The audience will have 1 point for every one of you. Let's go. Okay, thank you so much. You can put down. Wow, this seems to be quite close, I have to say.
Yeah.
So all the observers and the commentators, the three of you will make a sea change maybe in the final result. Who will be the winning team? Each of you will have 5 points, altogether 15 points. Are you ready for the voting? 3, 2, 1, go. Oh, terrific. Okay, so from the audience, Team A, 14 points. Team B, 17 points. But our experts, our panelists, seem to have different views. 2 voted for Team A, and 1 voted for Team B. So Team A, you got 24 points altogether. Team B, 22. Voila! How much fun! What a conversation. I am indebted to all our debaters and our commentators about the way they articulate the issue with reasons, numbers, facts, and also the ability to listen to the others. These qualities are urgently needed in a dramatically changing world, and critical thinking is the most important quality we all need to have. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team and CGTN, thank you so much for being with us. And we're looking forward to seeing you once again on Global Arena, special production of CGTN. Bye for now.